I've been studying the 1916 Battle of the Somme in archives and libraries on the battlefield itself, actually now for the most of my life. I've written a book on it, and it's accounted for substantial chapters in two others. I've written popular articles on the Somme. This month I got pieces in both History Today and the BBC History magazine, and they are actually different, although I must say I was tempted to pass the same one off twice. I didn't. And for those who really are gluttons for punishment, I've got a short piece in the Sunday Times magazine coming out this Sunday. Well, I mention this because apart from anything else, it demonstrates the continuing popular and media interest in the Somme, which I'll be talking about in the second part of my lecture, and also something about my role as a public historian, which I'll also be talking about. Now, I should say that I hope I haven't got anybody here under false pretenses, but since I gave that sort of holding title of the Battle of the Somme reassessed, I've actually thought long and hard about what I'm going to talk about this evening. In fact, I'm going to cover three subjects. First of all, I'm going to talk about my views on Haig and the Somme, which is very largely drawn from the Haig biography, the revised edition of which we are launching this evening. I'm then going to talk about, I think, a key bit of context of the Battle of the Somme as an attritional battle, which is surprisingly missed, particularly by popular media commentators. And finally, I'm going to look at how the Somme is viewed today by the media and indeed by the British government, and what that says about public history. Well, let me start by saying something about Haig and the Somme. He is popularly known as the butcher of the Somme, even though there is absolutely zero evidence that anybody called him that while the war was going on. It's very much a recent phenomenon. And yet Haig's career and reputation is in many ways defined by the battle fought between the 1st of July and the 18th of November 1916. Not, of course, by the victorious battles of the 100 days from August to November 1918, which is an interesting reflection on the way that we, the British, view the First World War. I would also say that I think it's far from clear that Haig's most important role in the First World War was as an operational commander. One of the themes of my book, and indeed the work of other historians in recent years, has been Haig as a war manager, a man who had far more responsibility than simply that of, in effect, an army group commander. In today's terminology, he was both an army group commander, but also a national contingent commander, the senior Brit on the Western Front dealing with the Allies, and a theatre commander, dealing with everything from the government to overseeing training and logistics. I think it's fair to say he probably had too many plates spinning at any one time, and his performance may have improved had he given up some of that responsibility, not that he was in the least bit keen so to do. Now, Haig, I think, has suffered in his reputation because he was a cavalryman by background and continued to believe throughout the war that the cavalry continued to have a place on the battlefield. Now, my distinguished Wolverhampton colleague, Professor Stephen Badsey, and several others have, I think, transformed our knowledge of British cavalry in the First World War in recent years. And so here I'm very much building on their work. But to me, it is pretty convincing that the British so-called hybrid cavalrymen of the First World War could both carry out the classic en blanche roles of scouting and reconnaissance, and indeed charging with sword and lance, and also carry out roles as, in effect, a mounted infantryman, riding to battle, dismounting, and then fighting. It seems clear to me that the idea that the First World War was a complete no-go area for cavalry on the Western Front is no longer tenable. There are certain examples, the most famous of which is the charge of two cavalry squadrons at High Wood on the 14th of July 1916, which demonstrated that there were, even on the conditions of the Somme, opportunities when cavalry could be used effectively, both in the en blanche role and in the mounted infantry role. You could argue there is a debate about whether the expenditure of time and resources was worth keeping that cavalry in the field. To my view, the answer is yes, and for this simple reason. Haig grasped that the deadlock on the Western Front between the end of 1914 and the spring of 1918 was a temporary phase, that mobile warfare sooner or later would start again. Of course, his timing was out quite considerably, but nonetheless he was right to recognise that this was a temporary phase. And when mobile warfare began again in 1918, I think the existence of a mounted arm, which could, at its simplest, move faster than retreating infantry, was, I think, a critical factor in British success. The Germans in the spring offensive of 1918 did not have cavalry. They'd effectively taken the decision not to bother with them any longer, and I think that actually hampered their operations. So to keep a mounted arm in the field as a viable possibility, I think was the right decision. Arguably, the real problem for the cavalry in 1918 was that it was, by that size, it was so shrunken in size, it was no longer capable of carrying out the very ambitious plans that Haig had for it. And we can certainly criticise him on those terms. But he was not wrong, I think, to use cavalry. And cavalry, I think, was key to Haig's concept for the Battle of the Somme, for the beginning of the Battle of the Somme. Now, everybody knows, or thinks they know anyway, that Haig's plan was to line up the artillery, batter a hole in the enemy positions, send the infantry through, and then push the cavalry through the so-called G in gap. Well, that's true up to a point, but actually I think it really underplays the subtlety of the approach. It wasn't simply a matter of sending cavalry through to gallop for the distant horizon. It was an idea of using cavalry with infantry to exploit gaps in the enemy positions, to open up the German defences, and then lead on to more mobile operations. I think if we can helpfully substitute the word mobile troops for cavalry, suddenly you get a very modern idea of what Haig was seeking to achieve. And whether we like it or not, really there was no alternative to cavalry at that stage, because tanks, in fact, did not see the fighting on the battlefront until September 1916, and even when they did, they were too slow and too unreliable to carry out the sort of exploitation operations that we associate with tanks in the Second World War. And so Haig really, I think, was right to see the importance of planning for success, and I think he was right to see cavalry as being the only way of carrying that out. But Haig had a plan B to his plan A. This is very clear all along. Haig recognised that the breakthrough might not come without some sustained fighting, attritional fighting, in other words. And I think that some historians in particular have, I think, wrongly set up so-called bite and hold operations. In other words, fighting limited battles, take a bite out of the enemy positions, hold them against counterattacks, smash up counterattacks, and then doing the same thing over again. In other words, very limited advances, basically down to attrition. They were naturally not a polar opposite to the idea of that leading to a breakthrough. What Haig was seeking to do, I think, was to crumble the enemy defences by actually building on the bites to crumble their defences and eventually feed mobile troops through. Again, all of this, if you forget it involves cavalry, and in fact, say it involves mobile troops, has a very modern ring to it indeed. And in the preparations for the Somme, Haig earmarked the reserve army, commanded by Lieutenant General Sir Hubert Gough, a combined cavalry-infantry formation, as being the force that actually would carry out these operations. It didn't happen, we know, and one of the reasons it didn't happen, and this is one of the things which I've stressed quite heavily in the Somme chapter in my book, possibly I think I'm the first historian, well, not the first historian, but I think I've probably made more of it than most historians have previously. is that one of the key reasons why this plan did not work is it was effectively sabotaged by Haig's principal subordinate operational level commander, that is Lieutenant General Sir Henry Rawlinson, commander of 4th Army. He might have been a general by that stage. Now, Haig and Rawlinson had a fundamental disagreement about the way that operations should be conducted. I've just explained what Haig thought should happen. Rawlinson, who is probably the man who coined the term, if not the concept, of bite and hold, really did not believe that there was any possibility of even limited mobile advances on the Somme. And since at part of the planning process, Gough's force was actually placed under Rawlinson's orders, he was in a position basically to neuter the concept at the key stage. And this actually played out around lunchtime on the 1st of July 1916. As well known, I suspect all of us know here, north of the long, straight Roman road that runs between Albert on the British side and Bapaume on the German side, pretty well everything to the north of that road is a failure. That limited gains are made early on, but the Germans drive the British back. The further south you go, however, from the road, the greater level of success is achieved, till you get to the extreme south of the British line, where 13 Corps take all of their objectives and are actually sitting on the German positions at lunchtime. To their right, the French are even more successful than that, and to some extent they're looking over their shoulders wondering where the Brits are. This is the opportunity for Haig's concept to be put into operation. But it doesn't happen. Rawlinson actually goes so far as to shut down any chance of exploiting these gains when he orders Reserve Army to stand down, and he doesn't actually even have his local operational reserve, 9th Scottish Division, ready to advance. Reading its diary, quite clear, he has actually decided there is no chance of anything happening. Now, some of this might be due to the fog of battle. It was very, very difficult indeed for information to reach the front line, to reach the rear area from the front line. And Rawlinson, I think, to some extent can be excused for this, but not entirely, because certainly some information was getting through. There's even one story, which unfortunately I haven't been able to corroborate, that 13 Corps commander, General Congreve, actually phoned Rawlinson early in the afternoon, told him accurately what was going on, and asked for permission to advance. But nothing happened. Let's just play the counterfactual game for a moment. What if Rawlinson had acted within the spirit, indeed the letter, of Haig's orders? That 9th Scottish Division had been sent forward, that the cavalry had been redeployed from the centre where they were positioned out to the flank and had launched an attack maybe late afternoon, early evening. Well, given that there was virtually nothing left on this German flank, even on the 2nd or even the 3rd of July, it's not inconceivable to think the British might have advanced 2, 3, 4 miles. Now, this is clearly not next stop Berlin, but in the context of 1916, in the context of the Somme, it would have taken them clear past appalling places like Delville Wood and High Wood, places which cost tens of thousands of lives in an attritional struggle over the following months. It would have taken them clear of those defences. It would have got round behind the German defences north of the road, and almost certainly would have triggered a German withdrawal. Let's be conservative and say the Germans pull back 10 miles and then they stop. Probably the British could go much further than that because of the problems with logistics, but as I say, they go back that far. Again, it is not war-winning in the sense of a gigantic battle of encirclement which the Germans destroyed, but in 1916 it was politically enormously important. It would have boosted Britain's position within the coalition, proving to our French allies we were actually pulling our weight. It's even conceivable, given that the pressure that we know the Germans were under because of attacks on many different fronts and some wavering on the home front in the summer of 1916, it's just about conceivable it might have caused the Germans to think and come up with some sort of compromise peace which the Allies could accept. But of course, we can't know what would have happened because it didn't. But all of this suggests to me that actually the Somme was winnable in the sense of a substantial achievement being made on the 1st of July. And if that had happened, not only would we remember the 1st of July as being victory plucked from the jaws of defeat, but I suspect we'd also be congratulating Douglas Haig on his advanced, very modern concept of using mobile forces in the advance. I could say a lot more about Douglas Haig, but I'm afraid you're going to have to read the book, preferably if you buy it first. But I'll just say one more thing about it. At the very end of the battle, he bumped into Major General Oliver Nugent, the commander of 36th Ulster Division. Now, these two men were not close at all, but actually got into a conversation, and they sort of talked about the way the battle had gone. And Nugent says something to the effect that we were too ambitious with what we were planning to do at the beginning of the Somme. And Haig says something on the lines of, you're right, we were all learning then. Now, Haig was not a man much given to self-criticism. His diary, which I edited with John Bourne a few years ago, is not really a reflective document. But on this occasion, the mask slipped. And actually, he was absolutely right. Everybody, including Haig himself, was learning during 1916. And what comes after, with the British battles in 17 and 18, I think to a very large extent build upon the lessons, the hard-won and bloody lessons learned on the Somme in 1916. Well, going on from that point, the Somme, of course, is, if nothing else, it's about attrition. And it's this attritional nature of the Somme which I think has been somewhat underplayed by certainly commentators in the media. I don't know if anybody lives in the area, but I was on the radio at about 11:15 this morning on Radio Coventry, telling people about how they got the Somme wrong. But that's fairly typical. In the case of some battles, Waterloo in 1815 is an obvious example, there were clear winners and losers. This, of course, is not the case with the Somme. When the battle had ended, the attackers had advanced about 7 miles, but had failed to rout the defenders or even to force them into a major retreat. Respective casualties, killed, wounded, missing, are a controversial issue, but they probably amounted to about 420,000 British, 200,000 French, and 500,000 to 600,000 Germans. There's been a suggestion that the German figure is much lower in the sort of 200,000s, but I simply don't buy that. It's based on a rather disputed source. So on the face of it, the battle ended in stalemate. However, placed in a wider perspective, the results of the battle very much favoured the Allies. The dreadful attrition, and please don't for one moment imagine that I'm actually downplaying what a ghastly experience it was for everybody, but the dreadful attrition could be better sustained by the British and French empires with their greater manpower resources than by the Germans. As I've already mentioned, by the end of the battle, in effect, the British Expeditionary Force had completed its apprenticeship and in 1917 was a much, much more experienced and competent army. The German army, by comparison, although still a formidable force, had lost key personnel. Now, this quote from Captain von Hentigern, but some of you might be familiar with it, but probably not the last bit. And I came across the full quote recently. I think this is pretty interesting. He said, "The Somme was the muddy grave of the German field army." That's the bit everybody knows. And he goes on to add, "dug by British industry and its shells." That, I think, is very telling. The Somme is not only about the British Army coming of age, it's also about the total war economy in Britain starting to catch up, not entirely there yet, but starting to catch up with the demands of the army on the Western Front, indeed elsewhere. And to steal a wonderful line from John Bourne, by 1918, Britain is fighting a rich man's war with effectively unlimited supplies of material. Limited supplies of everything, in fact, apart from manpower. They're not yet there on the Somme, but they're getting there. Thus, in attritional terms, I suggest that the Somme favoured the Allies, with morale, it must be said, substantially intact on both sides. But German High Command were extremely worried. They had previously underestimated the British Army. They now realise they're not up against two major enemy armies, the French and the Russians, but three. The British Army was naive in some ways, still not that well trained, but becoming better experienced, and it was there, fighting hard in very large numbers. The Germans responded in two main ways. For a start, they abandoned the Somme battlefield in 1917 and pulled back to the Hindenburg Line, actually a much better defensive position for the Germans, but one which did allow the Allies to paint the Somme as a clear victory, because they've abandoned the positions and pulled back. The most fateful decision was that the decision by Hindenburg and Ludendorff, they could not face another Somme-style battering on the Western Front. Instead, they would seek an alternative form of victory. They would try to starve the British into submission by releasing the U-boats to carry out unrestricted submarine warfare in the Atlantic, to sink any merchant ships, including, of course, ships from the neutral United States. They did this in the full knowledge this was almost definitely going to bring America into the war, but it was a gamble, not the first or not the last major gamble made by the Germans in the First World War, that they could defeat Britain before American potential could actually be translated into military power on the battlefield. It was, of course, a hugely costly strategic miscalculation. Put all these things together, I think it's fair to argue that while the Somme was not an Allied victory, as some historians have claimed, not a victory in the traditional sense, the Somme was a significant strategic success for the British and the French. And let me just pursue this attritional theme a little bit longer. The Somme, of course, was just one of many attritional battles fought between 1914 and 1918. Its effects cannot be divorced from that of Verdun, or the Western Front clashes in 1915, or the battles that were to follow in 1917 and 18, or the great campaigns on the Eastern Front. Attrition, the wearing away of the enemy's strength and morale, has not, to put it mildly, enjoyed a good press. But attrition is not, of course, confined to the First World War. All battles and campaigns involve attrition, whether it be heavily one-sided attrition, as in the 1991 Gulf War, or something like the one-day Napoleonic battles at Borodino and Waterloo. Western Front battles from late 14 to early 18 were different because of the peculiar tactical deadlock, a combination, a product of local circumstances, meant that battles were not only attritional, they were also largely static. Developments of weapons and tactics restored some mobility to battlefront in 1918, but the huge losses showed that attrition was still a major factor. And of course, attrition was not confined to the fighting fronts. It also took the form of submarine warfare and blockade, both of which were weapons aimed at starving the enemy population. Bombing of civilians, though of course puny by the standards of 1939 to 45, was another attritional weapon used in the First World War. This was in the very nature of total war. What's often forgotten, or at least in the media today, is attrition is equally important in the Second World War, a conflict that's even more total and more ghastly than that of the First World War. Actually, it wasn't for the Brits, for a whole set of peculiar circumstances, but for almost everybody else it was. And from our Britocentric point of view, we tend to lose track of that reality. The popular image of the Second World War is it's swift-moving and decisive. It's actually a product of the early years of the conflict. Just as peculiar conditions resulted in deadlock in 14 to 18, another set of peculiar circumstances in 1939 to 1941 produced the rapid German blitzkrieg victories. The German army was superior in doctrine, tactics and command to its opponents and was favoured by amazingly good fortune. Thus, France was defeated in only 6 weeks in 1940 and by casualties that were, by the standards of 1418, almost unbelievably light. Other states, Poland, Norway, Greece, were also quickly overrun, while in the North African desert, British Empire forces had a torrid time at the hands of Rommel. But even in the early years of the Second World War, it showed its attritional character. The 1940 Battle of Britain was an inherently attritional struggle in which the Luftwaffe failed to inflict sufficient damage on the RAF or Britain's defences in order to claim victory. The Battle of the Atlantic, just like its predecessor in the First World War, was all about sinking merchant shipping as Germany sought to exhaust British resources. And the German bombing campaign in 1940-41 was an attempt to destroy materiel and morale. Well, in the latter part of the war, of course, American and British aircraft took attrition to German cities with awesomely bloody and destructive results. From late 1941 onwards, Somme-style attrition returned to the battlefield, I would argue. In part, this was because the Germans had ridden their luck once too often. The sheer size of the Soviet Union, allied to the iron laws of logistics and stubborn resistance by the Red Army, meant that the Germans were unable to capitalise on their early successes in Operation Barbarossa. In the end, the Red Army transformed itself in contact to become a formidable and skillful enemy that could put vast resources into the field. British Empire forces, though not as numerous, also learnt lessons and became much more capable on the battlefield. And of course, the entry of the United States into the war in 1941 brought a large, fresh, and technologically advanced army into the anti-German coalition. So by the middle years of the Second World War, the German advantages which had served them so well in earlier years had been largely eliminated. Now armies were much more evenly matched, and not surprisingly, deadlock, and hence attrition, returned to the battlefield. Now this deadlock tended to be of shorter duration than the First World War. Tanks, motorised transport, and aircraft helped make fronts more mobile, and they restored the possibility of decisive manoeuvre, such as battles of encirclement, which really had been almost impossible to achieve on the Western Front in the First World War. But if you look at campaigns like Alamein, Stalingrad, Cassino, Normandy, they produced conditions highly reminiscent of the Western Front, complete with casualties that often equalled or exceeded those of a generation before. Occasionally I've played a game with students. I've given them an account of some fighting in Normandy in 1944, taken out a few sort of key things like mention of tanks and Spitfires. So which battle do you want to think this comes from? They almost always say the Somme or Passchendaele. Same regiments, same enemy, same dreadful conditions, same level of casualties. So attrition is the context in which the 1916 Battle of the Somme needs to be understood. It was not an aberration. It was all too typical of the type of high-intensity military operations of the period which had evolved by the Second World War without losing their essentially attritional character. Again, we the Brits actually are misled by our experience in the Second World War into missing this continuity of attrition. Firstly, well, the basic reason is because British casualties in the Second World War were much lower than those in the First. Two reasons for this. First, the army was much smaller. Second, unlike in 1418, the British army did not have to fight for a prolonged period against the main enemy. Defeat in 1940 and the Dunkirk evacuation ensured that. But when one goes to examine casualty rates for individual units, especially in the Normandy to the Baltic campaign of 44-45, it's a very different story of losses that would have been grimly familiar to soldiers who fought on the Somme 2 decades earlier. Well, placed in the context, the Somme does not become any less tragic, but in my view, it's no longer tenable to present it as somehow futile or meaningless. Undeniably, terrible mistakes were made by commanders from Haig downwards, in many cases the product of sheer inexperience. See my new book for details. But while these inflated the butcher's bill, they did not detract from the significance of the battle. Context is everything, and it's context which has been markedly absent from much recent public discourse in the UK about the First World War. So moving on to the last section of my talk, I'll start with the media coverage on the Somme. For the most part, it's been more of the same stuff that we have come to know and dislike over the years. Just a few days ago, on the 20th of June, the headline to a Daily Mail article made reference to 1 million men killed on the Somme, confusing casualties with fatalities. Now, 100,000, roughly speaking, British troops died on the Somme in 1916. That's bad enough. But to inflate those figures are just ridiculous. Even in the broadsheets, with some honourable exceptions, there has been little that even reflects as a significant academic debate about the battle. In announcing the radio and TV programmes to be aired by the BBC, Phil Dolling, the head of BBC Events, stated, and this paragraph is given prominence on the BBC website, "The Battle of the Somme was one of the bloodiest of World War I and has come to symbolise the horror of warfare. For just under 5 months, a brutal battle of attrition culminated in over 1 million men killed or wounded. We come together exactly 100 years on to remember and to pay tribute to all those who lost their lives." And Marty Davidson, the head of commissioning specialist faculty Factual TV, there's a wonderful title, was quoted as saying that the BBC programmes will give a new insight into events surrounding some of the most prominent battles of the Great War. New expert-led documentaries take you to the heart of these pivotal 2016, I think there's a typo there, battles, while audience can delve into individual accounts and explore the inspiration for music and song that grew out of personal experiences and lasting impact of the battles of Verdun, Jutland and the Somme. Well, these aren't wrong, precisely, what they say, but the first of these statements by a BBC bigwig gives no indication of the context of the battle that actually will be provided by the BBC, let alone detached analysis of the significance of the Somme, or even an acknowledgement that there's actually a healthy scholarly debate. He doesn't use the word futility, but he doesn't need to. The statement heads in only one direction. And the second statement covers much the same ground. The key words here at the battles are poignant, not strategically significant, or any other term that a historian might apply to them. The decision to highlight the cultural consequences of the battle rather than the political and military impacts, I think, is revealing. Now, I'm not arguing the cultural side of it is unimportant, but to stress music and song while ignoring strategy shows a bias between a particular interpretation of the First World War that reinforces rather than challenges conventional wisdom. I wasn't surprised to find that poetry has a significant part in the BBC's coverage of the Somme, but as far as I can tell, and of course I'm speaking before the programmes have been aired, so I may be wrong, I can't see there's a single programme on television or radio dedicated to the battle which reflects the important scholarly debates on the strategy and the conduct of the Somme. Now, there is a programme which looks at the story from the German side, which looks interesting. But as for the line about expert-led documentaries, well, I'm not decrying those of my fellow scholars who are fronting documentaries, but I've been surprised by how few people who are carrying out cutting-edge research on the Somme that the BBC have chosen to engage with. There was an opportunity in the centenary year for a major TV programme or even series thoroughly reassessing the Somme, which would have been an appropriate legacy. As far as I can tell, this opportunity has been comprehensively ducked. Well, much the same can be said about the UK government's programme of commemorative events. When announced by the Prime Minister, David Cameron, in October 2012, they include some obvious subjects: the outbreak of the war in August 1914, Gallipoli, Jutland and the Somme. Bizarrely, the 100 Days campaign of 1918, the battles that actually won the First World War, were completely ignored. This omission drew some heavy criticism from military historians, and later the PM publicly hinted there would be some commemoration of the 1918 battles, but as of today there's deafening silence on the matter. I would suggest that the the battles on the Western Front being omitted from the original list is evidence of the acceptance of the sort of futilities, donkeys narrative in governmental circles. Well, room was found for only one professional military academic historian on the government's advisory board. I'll give you a clue, it wasn't me, which in any case has been described by one insider as dysfunctional. The Western Front Association was not consulted in the run-up to the announcement, though it has been subsequently, in part, I think, because of our vigorous public criticism of the government plans. I think this mess is rooted in the deep unease, and this is not a party political point by any means, which successive governments have shown in dealing with the First World War centenary. There was never any chance that it would be treated in the same way as the 50th anniversaries of D-Day in 1994 and VE Day a year later, as unabashed celebrations of victory over a hated and feared enemy. The mythical version of the First World War has too strong a grip, and probably actually not going for a celebratory approach is the right thing. But instead of offering a clear interpretation of the First World War, or at least publicly acknowledging there are very different interpretations from the traditional one, British governments, certainly since 2010, have sent out signals that are at best confused and ambiguous. Thus, the then minister in 2014 with responsibility for commemorating the centenary stated that 1918 was an absolutely vital victory, but we won't be celebrating that fact. Well, the obvious response is to ask why the victory of 1918 should be treated any differently from that of 1945. Now, celebration, of course, does not necessarily equal triumphalism, but can be a public acknowledgement of an achievement, and it's celebration in this sense that the WFA has been pushing for. It's argued that it's not the government's role to interpret history. Well, they do when it suits them. The commemoration of Margaret Thatcher in the wake of her death in 2013 is a recent example of a government actively placing a particular interpretation on the career of a historically controversial and politically divisive figure. Well, just as, again, to quote Steve Badsey, just as television executives generally refuse to commission historical documentaries that portray controversies or unusual ideas, except as perhaps as a heavily flagged personal view, the government has taken a similar approach to the commemoration of the First World War. It has chosen to follow public opinion rather than taking a lead, perhaps scared of antagonising voters by challenging what are in some cases deeply held views about the supposed futility of the First World War. Well, the centenary of the Battle of the Somme would appear to offer a significant opportunity for the UK government to put forward a more balanced perspective, given that the place that the Somme has in the national collective memory as the worst moment, the benchmark of horror in the First World War. Well, I really don't need to explain to this audience, I think, the importance of the Somme. We've already covered that to a very large degree, but it's worth just sort of flagging up 2 points very briefly. The idea that the war was pointless is intellectually bankrupt. You know, the war is fought about big, major issues. It would have made a very large difference to the population of Europe if the Central Powers had won as opposed to the Allies. And so the idea, I think, that the war itself, is somehow futile, I think cannot be sustained. The other point about the Somme, of course, which is often missed, is that this is a French-driven battle. Why are the British fighting on the Somme? Essentially because they are the junior partners of the French, and the French want the British fighting next to them, in effect so they can keep an eye on this inexperienced tyro army. Well, little, if any, of this important context is reflected in the popular media and the government's approach to commemorating the centenary of the battle. Well, there are some debates between historians about whether the Somme actually justified the fighting. I've made very clear what my view is. At the very least, I would have thought that the arguments in favour of the Somme having meaning are too big simply to be ignored. But by focusing almost exclusively on loss and sacrifice, without admitting that there are other aspects of the Somme worthy of commemoration, the government are putting forward a conservative and, in scholarly terms, rather outdated interpretation. The failure even to place the Somme in the context of an attritional war fought by a coalition, I think, is particularly striking. Well, the government's stance on the Somme can be gauged from public statements made by John Whittingdale MP, the Secretary of State at the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, DCMS. Well, the DCMS's press release about the commemorative event to be held in Manchester on 1st July 1916, the centenary in other words, 2016, the centenary in other words, including this statement from the Secretary of State. The Battle of the Somme resulted in 1 million casualties on the Western Front and touched the lives of millions of families at home. It's important that we provide as many ways as we can for the public to commemorate the bravery and sacrifices of our ancestors 100 years ago. Well, if not actively misleading, this statement is certainly capable of being misinterpreted. Casualties is likely to be understood as fatalities by many readers. The figure of 1 million is arrived at by totalling British Empire, French and German casualties, but the context of the statement, the reference to home, implies there were 1 million British casualties on the Somme. The figure's 420,000, which is bad enough. And the statement is also interesting for what it does not say. He mentions bravery and sacrifices, but he does not mention what the Allies achieved on the Somme in the short term, or indeed in the longer term road to victory in 1918 perspective, let alone the Somme was part of a total war against an enemy which at the time was feared and hated by the vast majority of the British population. Although Whittingdale did not use the words, the impression he gave of the Somme was a futility of meaningless slaughter. He gave no context and ignored strategic consequences of the battle. By omission, I think he gives the impression that British soldiers on the Somme fought and died in vain. Well, perhaps we can make too much of a single ministerial soundbite, but this is what the government chose to put on its website. Moreover, the sentiments expressed are consistent with many other pronouncements by Whittingdale and other senior people in government over that period of time. He also referred to the Somme as being obviously the most significant commemorative event of the Great War centenary. Well, I think it's far from obvious that the Somme is the most important thing to commemorate. This privileging of this particular event over the others in the British experience of the Great War is, I think, very problematic. Recent attempts to promote Jutland as the battle that won the First World War has been, I think, fairly badly received by many scholars, but I think actually reflects the popular view of the Somme. It's another example of the failure to take this golden opportunity to use it for education. One final bit from this, and then I'll move on to say something else. He said, "We must never forget the scale of what happened at the Somme. More died on the first battle than any other day of the First World War." Well, this contrives to mix factual inaccuracy. 27,000 French soldiers died on the 22nd of August 1914, Battle of Frontiers, with its emphasis on casualties to the exclusion of everything else, and also note its relentless Britannicentrism. The one area where the government's narrative does depart from the traditional approach is in avoiding blaming Haig and the other generals. Presumably, it was felt that it would be inappropriate for the UK government overtly to criticise British military commanders, even those of a century ago. Recent perceived military failures in Iraq and Afghanistan have promoted something of a new lions led by donkeys narrative, and there are obvious political dangers in stressing high-level military ineptitude. It's deeply disappointing that the lineal successor of the government that sent the troops to fight on the Somme is unwilling publicly to recognise the importance of the battle and what those men achieved. Some would use a much harsher term than disappointing. By omitting to provide context or engaging with historical debates, the UK government is giving an ahistorical impression that British soldiers fought and died on the Somme in vain. Does any of this matter? I believe it does. History is not a matter of antiquarianism, an intellectual parlour game. History is a powerful force shaping identities and moulding how people think and behave. History is not neutral. History is written and interpreted by individuals. It matters today whether the Battle of the Somme is depicted as a futile bloodbath, because it helps shape people's views of war, society, and the UK's place in the world. Or look at the island of Ireland, where the exploits of the 36th Ulster Division on the Somme have long played a key role in shaping Protestant unionist identity. But the part played by the Catholic nationalist 16th Irish Division was until recently downplayed in the Republic as being, frankly, an embarrassment. Well, today, thankfully, the shared experience of the Somme and the First World War more widely has been used as a vehicle for reconciliation on the island of Ireland. And I think I'd like to pay tribute to colleagues in both islands, indeed to some pioneering journalists who are helping to bring about this change. And very close to home, the recent political campaign in the UK has brought forth the despairing cry that we now live in a post-fact era, in which figures and assertions are put forward, are shown as wrong, but zombie-like refuse to lay down and die. Indeed, experts are now regularly derided precisely because of their expertise. History, of course, is not just about facts. It's also about interpretations. And interpretations, in turn, depend on nuance. We've seen precious little of that. Indeed, there have been examples of which I can only describe as the prostitution of history, although not, I think it's fair to say, by those with expertise in the subject. This is not conducive to helping the electorate make up their mind on the basis of informed, educated choices about major issues. Well, for me, one of the lessons is that public historians are more important than ever. Alongside our learned articles and monographs, we need to be out there, giving talks to schools and societies, particularly to teachers, a really, really important audience. Writing articles for newspapers and magazines, engaging with radio and television, although long experience has taught me you need to use a very long spoon when dealing with the latter. And getting out there on social media, for example, on Twitter. But the Somme centenary is demonstrating, I think, the limitations of the influence of public historians. Marginalised by the mass media and the government, public historians can only do so much to shape opinion. But that's not a reason to stop trying. The Battle of the Somme casts an extremely long shadow. When I think about it, the overwhelming feeling is of horror, pity, and the fervent wish that nothing like that would ever happen again. The Somme is quite simply too ghastly to be wrapped in a blanket of myths and half-truths. Painting the Somme as some sort of aberration to 20th century warfare could not be more wrong. Tragically, it was all too typical of the attritional battles fought by armies produced by modern, industrialised states. Failing to engage with the nuances of a complex topic does no one any favours. Bad history is a very dangerous thing indeed. Thank you very much.
If you want to find the sergeant, I know where he is. He's drinking all the company rum. If you want to find the private, I know where he is. I know where he is. I know where he is. If you want to find the private, I know where he is. He's hanging on the